Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I'm the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana at 5600 Van Road. We would love to have you join us for our 9 a.m. Sunday Bible classes and our 10 a.m. worship. We have classes for all ages, and we also have an afternoon worship period on Sundays at 4, and we'd encourage you to join us for that as well, or if it's just more convenient for you. You could also join us for our Wednesday evening Bible classes. Those begin at 6:30. If you'd like to get in touch with us, then feel free to give us a call or send a text to 812-550-6234, or send email to info@riverridgechurch.org, and we would love to hear from you and get back to you as soon as we can. Now, a month ago, I made a program that looked over the Israelite period of exile in Babylon and elsewhere, I suppose, and their restoration then to the land that God had promised to their forefathers forever. So in that episode, we talked about some of the reasons for their exile. We talked about where they were exiled, both the northern 10 tribes and then the southern couple of tribes, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, in, various places, and then in Babylon for the Judeans. We talked about the return. We talked about the sort of continuing exile, I suppose we could say, because a relative handful of Jews returned when allowed to do so. And then we talked about what happened in that land, the rebuilding of the temple and the rebuilding of Jerusalem in particular. So what happened after all of that? Amos chapter 8. Beginning in verse 7. The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of their deeds. Shall not the land tremble on this account, and everyone mourn who dwells in it, and all of it rise like the Nile, and be tossed about, and sink again like the Nile of Egypt? And on that day, declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon, and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your feasts into mourning, and all your songs into lamentation. I will bring sackcloth on every waist, and baldness on every head. I will make it like the morning for an only son, and the end of it like a bitter day. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord God, when I will send a famine on the land, not a famine of bread, nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. They shall wander from sea to sea, and from north to east. They shall run to and fro to seek the word of the Lord, but they shall not find it. Amos wrote in the early 8th century BC. His focus was the coming fall of those northern 10 tribes. When that happened, the exiles from the north would be physically barred from the prophetic institution and from the religion that was centered at Jerusalem. After another 150 years or so, the temple there would be destroyed, and the prophetic institution centered there would also be, that much further disrupted, and we could even say destroyed. To a lesser extent, Amos is talking about the southern kingdom's fall, too. But even then, there were still prophets. We talked about them in that last installment. Guys like Jeremiah, who outlasted the city of Jerusalem and continued to prophesy afterward. Another one is Ezekiel, who continues to prophesy in exile. Daniel is the same thing. Daniel continues his prophetic work from the very beginning of the exile to well after Cyrus's proclamation, when the Jews were given permission to return back to their hereditary lands. Plus, that exile was a relatively short period, and then the whole thing was, reconstructed, temple and all. And God sent more prophets, Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi. But what about after that? Well, during that time, Rabbinic Judaism began to grow during those 4 centuries between Malachi and Jesus. But those guys, these rabbis, they had to rely on sources and precedents and their own reason, and that sounds, pretty normal to us, because we operate in similar fashion. But up until that time, not that there was an absence of, source and precedent and reason, but up until that time, there was a much readier access, most of the time, to prophets who could just tell you what God says in response to even very specific questions. Let me give you an example of this. In 1 Samuel chapter 30, beginning in verse 8, And David inquired of the Lord, Shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? He answered him, Pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. So David set out, and the 600 men who were with him. Well, that was awfully convenient for David, wasn't it? Now, of course, it's not like everyone could do that. David is a relatively privileged individual, I guess we could say, in this regard. But the provision was there, at least on the level of the nation. During that time, during the monarchy and later the divided monarchy, there were even what we could call schools of the prophets. So, for example, if we look at 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 38 says, "And Elisha came again to Gilgal when there was a famine in the land. And as the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, he said to his servant, Set on the large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets." We skip down to verse 42. "A man came from Baal-Shalisha, bringing the man of God bread of the firstfruits, 20 loaves of barley, and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, Give to the men that they may eat. But his servant said, How can I set this before 100 men? We've got 100 guys here who are collectively called the sons of the prophets. This isn't like, Elijah has a son, and Elisha has a son, and, Micaiah has a son, and Obadiah has a son. I'm sure that it started kind of like that, where it's sort of a hereditary occupation in the way that most occupations were during, everything before the modern period, frankly. But it means something a little bit more, technical than that. Jump forward to chapter 6. "Now the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, See, the place where we dwell under your charge is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan, and each of us get there a log, and let us make a place for us to dwell there. And he answered, Go." You see what's going on here? It's more like members of a guild of prophets than, just the collected children of the prophets. And that's a pretty common Hebrew expression. Sons of whatever this thing doesn't necessarily literally mean the male offspring of whatever that is. So that shouldn't be too big of a surprise. Now, what we've read about here is just in one, possibly two locations, Gilgal and maybe another which is unnamed. There are more of these sons of the prophets in Bethel and in Jericho. We can read about them in 2 Kings 2 if you want to go do that after the show. There are almost certainly other locations where there's a school of prophets, as I said before, a collection of this sort of guild. We don't read all that much about these guys, but they're there. At least they were there. Because God said through Amos that he was going to, clam up at some point. And that's what he did. Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me." And then verse 5, "Then I will draw near to you for judgment." And then chapter 4, verse 1, "For behold, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and all evildoers will be stubble." And jump to verse 4, "Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction." So on the one hand, God has promised to send his messenger, and I think that refers to two guys, to Malachi, because, my messenger, that's Malachi in Hebrew, Malachi, and it's also looking forward to New Testament things. He has promised at the end of chapter 4 to send them Elijah the prophet, but it's also as if he's kind of signing off. He's saying, I'm going to send you that prophet. Wait until then. And the way that this book Malachi ends, it's a lot more final than the end of most of the prophetic books. And those usually just kind of say what's going to happen. They usually save the pleasant stuff for last. Malachi also tells them what God is going to do and whom to expect. Elijah, as I said, the greatest of the prophets. Luke chapter 1, verse 16, the angel Gabriel tells Zechariah about, the son that is to be born to him, and he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared. This is about John the Baptist. John the Baptist is that Elijah of whom Malachi spoke. Now, John didn't start preaching that the kingdom of heaven was at hand until shortly before Jesus himself started to preach, around or just before AD 30. Malachi prophesied sometime after the rebuilding of the temple, which was completed in 516 BC, probably several decades later, maybe in the mid-400s or so. And then, it was basically nothing. I mean, of course, things happened, but God doesn't insert himself into the situation in any vocal sense. Now, after all of that build-up, You might be surprised then when I say that we can still read about this period of no prophecy in one of God's Old Testament prophets. It's Daniel. Now, you may remember the first dream of Nebuchadnezzar of a great image, almost like an idol, with a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, and then lower legs of iron and feet of iron and clay. Daniel interpreted that for Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 2. Let's pick up in verse 37. You, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all, you are the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. The kingdom that supplanted the Babylonians was the Achaemenid Empire. Achaemenid, there are so many ways to say that, and none of them is particularly good. I'll go with Persia. That's easier. The Persian period ushered in the return and restoration of Israel. Chapter 2 of Daniel here isn't the only place in Daniel, though, where this comes up. In fact, chapter 8, let's pick up in verse 3. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and became great. This is about a coalition of Medes and Persians, so you've got 2 separate camps there. Formerly, this coalition was dominated by Media, but it was giving way to Persia, hence the horns. Really? I mean, that sounds pretty far-fetched. Is that just my take on it? Well, in verse 20, Gabriel says, As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. The Persian Empire was gigantic. Within it, Judea was a tiny little speck, forgotten by almost everyone, no more than a shadow of its past and former glory, as far as anyone else was concerned. Let's keep going, verse 5. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram, and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. This, of course, refers to Alexander of Macedon, otherwise known as Alexander the Great. This is the beginning of the Greek period, which, to go back to that first vision, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, would be the belly and thighs of bronze of that great image. So Alexander, well, first of all, he had to conquer Greece, and then as he expanded and moved his way to the east, he conquered Judea and the surrounding area. He continued south, he conquered Egypt. Then he moved over farther to the east, well, back up north and then to the east, and conquered the Persians. In so doing, he also spread the Greek culture everywhere that he went, and this came to be called Hellenism. Verse 8. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the horns and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. That Greek kingdom, was going to split. And it would not just split between, 2 parties, it would actually split basically 4 ways. We could say that there were 5, but one of those fizzled out really quickly. Verse 22. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. He shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men, and the people who are the saints. Okay, so this is basically covering what's going to happen for those next several centuries, and while it primarily concerns, let's say, the geopolitics of the region, the effect on the saints is not being ignored, is it? It's not going to be particularly pleasant for the people of God. As we jump forward in Daniel, we'll find more about this period. In chapter 11, let's read verses 5 and 6. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. But she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. Let's put some names to these people. Okay, so backing up a moment, it split 4 ways, we said. Well, it went to 4 generals: Lysimachus, Antigonus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. There's also Cassander, but again, pretty short-lived. Now, mostly this is going to be concerned with Ptolemy and Seleucus. You've got Egypt in the south, that's Ptolemy and his offspring, and then Seleucus in the north, which is basically headquartered in Syria. So, south, north. Now, Seleucus I, he took refuge for a time with Ptolemy I, and then later he returned to Babylon and retook power over his region, and he ended up becoming greater than Ptolemy I. Now, their sons, Antiochus and the imaginatively named Ptolemy II, by the year 277 BC, as they solidified these kingdoms, it was actually narrowed down to just 3 Hellenistic kingdoms, these 2, and then the less important Antigonids over to the west. Now, as verse 6 predicted, Berenike, the daughter of Ptolemy II, would be used to construct a political alliance between the king of the south and the king of the north. The idea was to make friends, maybe even join their kingdoms in the coming generations. And also, as it was predicted, this failed very badly. Let's pick up in verse 7. And from a branch from her roots one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army, and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them, and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images, and their precious vessels of silver and gold, and for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. Now we've got Ptolemy III and the latter, Seleucus II, exchanging attacks. Now, this is all well and good as we try to understand, well, what Daniel is prophesying and the geopolitics of the time, but let's not lose in the mix of all of this what's really important. Who's in the middle between the Ptolemies in the south in Egypt and the Seleucids in the north in Syria? Every time they attack each other, they got to go through Israel-Palestine. Well, let's pick up in verse 10. His sons shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north, and he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. Okay, so his sons attack and stir Ptolemy III to react. There's a temporary victory for the south up until Seleucus III is assassinated. By 198 BC, the king of the north, who's now Antiochus III, had taken control of Judea away from the king of the south. Verse 14. In those times many shall arise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. Aha! So among those who revolted were the Jews, but Ptolemy V's general quickly subdued this revolt. Verse 15. Then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. So when this revolt happened, it created an opening for Antiochus III from the north, and so he came down and took it, which presumably is Jerusalem, from Ptolemy V. Verse 16. But he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. He shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. Antiochus III's daughter Cleopatra is supposed to be the catalyst for this new alliance, because it worked so well the last time. No surprise, fails again. And before you ask, yes, we're talking about that Cleopatra. Wait, which Cleopatra were you thinking of? If you were thinking of the one who married two of her brothers and had a fling with Julius Caesar and claimed to have conceived a child with him, and then ruled over Egypt for a time, shacked up with Mark Antony, lost the Battle of Actium, and then killed herself, leading to her kingdom Egypt being subsumed by the Roman Empire. No, not that one. That was Cleopatra the Seventh. We're talking about Cleopatra the First, her great-great-grandmother, and also her great-great-great-great-grandmother. Their family tree was more like a spider web than a tree. Anyway, verses 18 and 19. Afterward he shall turn his face to the coastlands, and shall capture many of them, but a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn his face back toward the fortresses of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall, and shall not be found. So Antiochus III heads to the west. He hits the Romans in Asia Minor. Bad idea. He was defeated, and then he turned tail and ran, and was killed by a mob of his own people. Verse 20. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. Seleucus IV sent a tax collector named Heliodorus to raise tribute funds, which were being demanded by the rising Rome. Heliodorus soon poisoned Seleucus IV, leading to a goofy succession that ends up with Seleucus's brother, Antiochus IV, in power. Verse 21. In his place shall arise a contemptible person, to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. So Antiochus IV sounds like a real stand-up character. He proceeds to oppress the Jews, to repeatedly trample Judea and Samaria and Galilee in fighting his nephew Ptolemy VI from Egypt. In 167 BC, Antiochus IV would loot the temple and then set up there an altar to Zeus. He would sacrifice pigs on the Lord's altar. He would outlaw circumcision. Verse 31, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. Well, a priest named Mattathias has had enough by verse 32. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know God shall stand firm and take action. Mattathias stands up and he leads a revolt and expels the Seleucids. They have to take the temple, first of all, and then they have to repurify and rededicate the temple, restore proper worship. By the way, that's commemorated in a Jewish feast called Hanukkah, which means the dedication. This is the beginning of what is called the Maccabean period. Maccabee, that comes from a Hebrew word for hammer, which was a nickname given to Mattathias' son, Judas, and then later given to his brothers as well. So you've got a whole series of hammers, a whole series of Maccabees. So this is, well, it's kind of a renaissance for the Israelites. That there's conquest, and even for multiple generations, the kingdom grows, their authority, their power grows. By the way, there is rule by the priesthood, which seems like, well, the early stages of fulfillment for those grand promises that God made. But it would devolve into civil war when brothers refused to agree. There's a political division amongst the Maccabees between Aristobulus II, who has a distinctly Greek and non-Hebrew name, and Hyrcanus II, who has a much more Hebrew name. That gives you some indication of where things are going. There's also religious division between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the two main sects. We could also talk about the Essenes, but in 63 BC, Aristobulus's agent Scaurus invited Pompey the Great, the Roman general, to come in and help settle things because of this ongoing civil war. Do you know the Roman method of settling things? It's just to take over. At this point, the stage is mostly set for Christ, but not before some more civil war between the brother of Herod the Great and the final Hasmonean king, Antigonus, who's the son of Aristobulus II. And then Rome intervened in 40 BC and named Herod king of the Jews. Meanwhile, Rome was shifting from a republic to an empire. Herod the Great was renovating the temple, not that he cared that much about God. He was also busying himself with marrying multiple women named Mariamne and then killing off most of his immediate family, often for no reason at all. And shortly before his death, he heard from some weird Eastern sages that he had a new rival for the title, King of the Jews. That's a lot of chaos between Malachi and Matthew, isn't it? Wasn't it pretty amazing to follow God's detailed predictions and tie them to their simple historical fulfillments? If you just picked up Daniel and started wish casting, then your expectations would probably be a bit different from the truth, though. And I suppose that can teach us a lot about interpreting the rest of apocalyptic prophecy. In retrospect, it's always pretty obvious. Oh, duh, this refers to that. But when you don't have the actual event to look back on and then match the two up, and you just start reading the King of the North and the King of the South and all these sort of grandiose images and metaphors and whatnot, and then you start imagining how it would probably look, it's not quite so simple then, is it? I am struck by the alternating cooperation and backbiting and open conflict. This happened between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. It happened between the four generals of Alexander the Great, for that matter. It happened between the Maccabean rulers of Israel and, Israelites even after that period was winding down and basically over with. It should not surprise us when this sort of thing happens today, even between brothers. It should disappoint us, but it shouldn't surprise us. When we're in the midst of it, it always seems unthinkable that our friends would work against us or that we would ever betray them. But bad people ruin good things. And that's another theme that occurs over and over through this period between the Testaments. It's especially obvious in the danger of unequal yokes, I suppose, but even people we wouldn't be so comfortable calling bad are still quite skilled at ruining things. All of this serves to remind us that earthly victory is not the stamp of God's approval. You see, to hear the victors tell it, the good guys have won every single war in all of human history. That seems a little shady to me. But even if it takes a while, God does pass judgment on the wicked. Eventually, in this life, it happens one way or another, but even that is just a down payment for what is to come. I'll leave you with Daniel 11:32 again. We touched on this almost in passing, but I think it is probably the best focal point for this study. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. As it was then, so it is now. There are different actors involved, but they're playing basically the same roles. Don't be seduced by the powerful and flattering people of this world. They might make a show of caring about you, and they might build up your self-esteem. But when they get what they want out of you, they will cast you aside like a used Kleenex. Instead, keep the covenant that Jesus inaugurated in his own blood for your eternal salvation, to rescue you from certain doom. Stand firm and take action. If you need to take the first action in joining that covenant today, then we would love to help at River Ridge. Please get in touch with us. You can reach us by phone at 812-550-6234 or send an email to info@riverridgechurch.org. You can also find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh for Sunday morning worship at 10. I hope to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.